Every empire in human history has followed a remarkably similar pattern, a rise fueled by ambition, innovation, and often military conquest, followed by a peak of unprecedented power, and then, inevitably, a decline that those living through it rarely recognize until it is far too late. Today, we are going to have one of the most important conversations you can have as an American citizen in the 21st century. And that conversation centers on a simple but profound question. Where exactly does the United States stand in the life cycle of great powers? Are we still ascending? Are we at our peak? Or have we already begun the slow, sometimes imperceptible slide towards something less than what we once were? To answer this question, we need to examine three of the most significant power structures in human history: the Roman Empire, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union, because each of these entities rose to dominate their known world. Each believed their supremacy was permanent, and each ultimately fell in ways that offer haunting parallels to what we see unfolding in America today. This is not a doom and gloom video designed to make you feel hopeless, nor is it a political piece meant to blame one party or another, because the forces that shape the destiny of nations operate on timescales and through mechanisms that transcend any single election cycle or administration. Let us begin with Rome, the eternal city, the empire that gave us roads, aqueducts, legal systems, and the very concept of Western civilization. Rome did not fall in a single day, and its decline stretched across centuries, making it nearly invisible to those who lived through it. At its height, under Emperor Trajan around 117 AD, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean world, and its citizens enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and security. But beneath this glittering surface, cracks were forming. The first crack was economic. Rome's expansion had been fueled by conquest, which brought slaves, gold, and tribute. But once the empire stopped expanding, the economic model broke down. The costs of maintaining the military did not decrease, but the influx of wealth ceased, and Rome found itself spending more than it was taking in. Does this sound familiar? The United States today spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, maintains over 750 military bases worldwide, and has seen its national debt climb past $34 trillion with no end in sight. Like Rome, America built its post-World War II prosperity partly on economic dominance that came from being the only major industrial power left standing. But that advantage has eroded while the commitments and spending remain. The second major factor in Rome's decline was currency debasement. When Rome could no longer pay for its empire through conquest, it reduced the silver content in its coins. Under Nero, the denarius contained about 90% silver. By the time of Gallienus in the 260s, it contained less than 5%. Prices skyrocketed and savings became worthless. The United States does not debase physical coins, but since abandoning the gold standard in 1971, the purchasing power of the dollar has declined by over 95%. The Federal Reserve has printed trillions of dollars in response to various crises, creating asset bubbles and wealth inequality. The Roman citizen who watched his savings become worthless, and the American worker who watches home prices and healthcare expenses outpace wage growth are experiencing the same fundamental problem, an economic system eroding the foundation upon which the middle class stands. The third parallel lies in political dysfunction. Rome began as a republic with checks and balances designed to prevent any faction from accumulating too much power. But over time, these institutions became corrupted by political ambition and wealth concentration. The rise of military strongmen like Marius, Sulla, and Julius Caesar followed a pattern where each violation of republican norms made the next violation more acceptable, until the republic was replaced by the empire. In America today, we see similar patterns: Congress's inability to pass meaningful legislation, the rise of executive power through orders and emergency declarations, the politicization of the Supreme Court, and the growing willingness of political factions to view opponents not as fellow citizens, but as existential enemies. The fourth parallel concerns immigration and cultural cohesion. Rome relied increasingly on non-Roman peoples to fill its legions, and while many were successfully assimilated,
The sheer scale of migration, combined with weakening central authority, led to fragmentation of Roman identity. America's current debates over immigration policy and national identity reflect genuine tensions about demographic change and what it means to be American. The fifth parallel is the loss of civic virtue. The early republic was characterized by service and sacrifice, but by the late empire, civic virtue had disappeared, replaced by a culture of entertainment and dependence. The famous phrase, bread and circuses, described a population that traded active citizenship for passive consumption. In America today, we see declining civic participation, low trust in institutions, and a population increasingly divided into information bubbles.
Now let us turn to the British Empire, a more recent and perhaps more relevant comparison. Britain, at its height, controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, the Royal Navy dominated the oceans, and British industry led the world. Yet within a single lifetime, from World War I to the Suez Crisis in 1956, the British Empire essentially ceased to exist. The first factor was imperial overstretch. Britain, after World War I, was nominally victorious, but actually exhausted, having lost a generation of young men, accumulated massive debts to the United States, and stretched its resources to the breaking point. The United States today maintains military commitments across the globe, and there is growing question about whether American power is sufficient to fulfill all these commitments simultaneously against rising competitors like China. The second factor was loss of industrial competitiveness. Britain had been the workshop of the world, but by the late 19th century, it was being overtaken by Germany and the United States in key industries. British industry had become complacent, relying on captive colonial markets rather than innovating. America faces similar challenges: the hollowing out of manufacturing, chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, an education system producing mediocre results compared to international competitors, and growing Chinese investment in frontier technologies. The third factor was the two world wars, which consumed British wealth and prestige. World War I killed over 700,000 British servicemen, and World War II left Britain bankrupt. America has not experienced anything comparable, but the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq lasted 2 decades, cost over $8 trillion, and achieved little. The Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021 was America's Suez moment, demonstrating the gap between American ambitions and capabilities. The fourth factor was losing reserve currency status. The pound's role gave Britain enormous advantages, but the costs of war eroded sterling's position until the dollar took supremacy at Bretton Woods. America today enjoys this same privilege, but there are growing efforts by China and Russia to develop alternative payment systems. If the dollar loses its central role, America will face the same reckoning Britain faced. Now we turn to the Soviet Union, a case study in sudden collapse rather than gradual decline. The USSR possessed the world's largest nuclear arsenal, the largest army, vast territory and resources, and a space program that achieved historic firsts. Soviet ideology claimed historical inevitability, yet in 1991, without foreign invasion or major military defeat, the USSR simply ceased to exist. The first lesson concerns ideological rigidity. The Soviet system could not tolerate criticism, and as a result lost the ability to correct errors. Bad news was suppressed, and leadership lived in an information bubble. America is not the Soviet Union, but there are worrying trends toward ideological conformity, suppression of dissenting viewpoints in academia and media, and separate information ecosystems where liberals and conservatives consume entirely different news and hold entirely different views of reality. A nation that cannot agree on basic facts is losing the capacity for self-correction. The second lesson concerns economic stagnation. The Soviet command economy could mobilize resources for specific projects, but was incapable of distributed innovation. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing and the technology gap was widening.
America's economy remains more dynamic, but there are signs of sclerosis: declining business formation, increasing industry concentration, declining productivity growth, and a financial system rewarding speculation over productive investment. The American dream of upward mobility has stalled for many Americans. The third lesson concerns military overextension. The Soviets spent perhaps 15 to 20% of GDP on military, starving the civilian economy. The Afghanistan War from 1979 to 1989 was particularly costly in lives, rubles, and morale. America spends less proportionally, but the opportunity costs are real, and the psychological costs of forever wars have eroded national unity. The fourth lesson is loss of legitimacy. By the late 1980s, almost no one in the Soviet Union believed in communist ideology. When reforms removed fear without providing alternative legitimacy, the structure collapsed. Americans retain higher national pride than late Soviet citizens, but trust in government, media, and corporations has declined dramatically, and young Americans express skepticism about capitalism and democracy that would have been unthinkable a generation ago.
So where does this leave us? What stage is America really in? The honest answer is we do not know, because history never repeats exactly, and America has resources that none of these previous powers possessed. America has the world's largest economy, most innovative technology sector, most powerful military, most prestigious universities, and geographic protection from devastating wars. America has successfully reinvented itself before, from the Civil War to the Great Depression to the 1960s upheavals. The comparison to Rome, Britain, and the USSR is meant to highlight warning signs and ask whether we are taking them seriously. What indicators should we watch? First, the fiscal trajectory. National debt larger than GDP, growing interest payments, no political will to address structural imbalances. Second, political dysfunction. Inability to address major challenges, erosion of norms constraining political conflict. Third, social fragmentation. Loss of shared narratives, sorting into separate communities, rise of affective polarization where partisans despise each other. Fourth, economic hollowing, shift from production to consumption, from manufacturing to finance, growth of billionaires and precarious workers but shrinking middle class. Fifth, cultural exhaustion, loss of confidence in the American project, rise of cynicism, inability to articulate compelling vision. But there are reasons for hope. America's demographic profile is healthier than China, Russia, Japan, or Europe. American higher education continues attracting the world's best students. The military remains capable and is adapting to new domains. The financial system shows resilience. American culture continues exercising soft power no other nation matches. The decline of great powers is not instantaneous. Rome took centuries, while the Soviet Union took months. Where America falls on that spectrum depends on choices not yet made. What can citizens do? First, awareness, understanding historical patterns and recognizing warning signs. Second, engagement, recognizing democracy is not a spectator sport. Third, honesty, having difficult conversations about problems neither party wants to address. Fourth, humility, recognizing America is not exempt from history and that greatness is not guaranteed. The Roman citizen of the 2nd century, the British subject of the Edwardian era, the Soviet citizen of the 1970s, all believed their systems were permanent. They were wrong, and we may be wrong too, unless we learn from their examples. This video is not predicting American collapse, because such predictions have been proven wrong before, but the patterns are there, the warning signs are flashing, and our choices will determine whether America remains a great power or follows Rome, Britain, and the Soviet Union into history as another empire that rose, peaked, and fell. The question is whether we have the wisdom to see, the courage to act, and the unity to work together. That is the challenge of our generation.